The presenter tonight is the author of this report who's been working on it for years. Many of you know him, Dr. Ira Helfand. He's the chair of our security committee, and that's a board leader that I get to work with quite closely. He's been an emergency room physician for many years, is practicing now internal medicine at an urgent care facility in Springfield, Massachusetts, past president of PSR, and current North American Vice President of our global federation, the Nobel Peace Prize-winning International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. We're thrilled you're here, and thank you, Ira, just rushing back from Vienna to present with all of you tonight. I'll hand it over to Ira.
Thanks, David, and thanks everybody for being on the webinar tonight. I'm really delighted to be able to take the opportunity to sort of go over the nuclear famine data that we generated with you. And make sure that everybody feels familiar and comfortable with this, because I'm hoping that all of us in PSR will start talking about this. It turns out that when we first started looking at this question back in 2007, when we first became aware of the studies done by Thun and Robach about what would happen to the climate if there were a limited nuclear war, we felt then that this would probably be something that had huge medical implications and would be something that would help us to educate the public and decision makers about the medical consequences of nuclear war in general, sort of a new angle that would get their attention. And since the release of the report a couple of weeks ago, there's been very strong evidence that that is exactly the case. The press coverage here in the United States wasn't perhaps quite as strong as we would have liked, although it wasn't bad. In some parts of the world, notably South Asia, it was extremely strong. And the data has made its way into policy-making circles already. At the recent, actually still ongoing, NPT Prep Con meeting in Vienna, there was a very strong focus at this year's session on the humanitarian, as we would call it, medical consequences of nuclear war, to the great consternation of the P5 nations, which were trying very hard to steer the conversation into the usual circular discussion about, technical questions and things that don't really move things forward. Most of the states present at the meeting didn't want to talk about that. They wanted to talk about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war. And 16 of them joined the Swiss government in a joint statement which they released, which made specific reference to the nuclear famine data. The study, as you may know, was financed by the Swiss Foreign Ministry, and they have been working very hard, especially with the Norwegian Foreign Ministry, to get this information out. So there's some evidence that this really has getting some traction already, and I think it gives us the opportunity to really have an impact on the ongoing conversation around the globe at this point about what should happen with nuclear weapons. The scenario that we looked at was focused on South Asia. There are a number of reasons for this. One is that both India and Pakistan are nuclear powers. The other is that they have a very troubled relationship at the moment and have had 3 wars since gaining independence back in the late 1940s, and have come close to war on 2 other occasions since they developed nuclear weapons. During both occasions, their nuclear forces were in very high alert. There are reports that during the last standoff after the terrorist attack on the Indian Parliament in the late 90s, had planes on the runway with nuclear weapons in their bomb bays, with the engines running for more than a week, with rotating relays of pilots coming into the cockpit so they were ready at all times to take off. So the possibility of a nuclear conflict in South Asia is a very real danger, and that was really the reason why this was the focus for this scenario. It was assumed in the scenario that each of the 2 countries, India and Pakistan, used 50 warheads, and that each of these were roughly the size of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, and that they targeted cities in the other country. The local effects are extremely severe. There are 20 million prompt deaths from the explosions and the firestorms and from the immediate radiation that's released by these weapons. And to put that into context, during all of World War II, about 50 million people died. But that was during 8 years, from the first Japanese intervention in Manchuria in 1937 until the end of the war in 1945. This would be 20 million deaths occurring in the course of about a week, an event really unparalleled in human history. In addition, there would be extensive radioactive contamination throughout South Asia, which over time would contribute many additional casualties and deaths. But it turns out that it is not the local effects, the direct local effects, that are the most disastrous. Rather, it is the climate disruption which takes place as a result of the firestorms which burn these 100 cities and push large quantities of smoke and soot into the upper atmosphere. The amount of soot was estimated as perhaps up to 6.6 million tons, 6.6 teragrams of black carbon that would go up into the troposphere, where it would block out sunlight, dropping temperatures across the planet, and causing also a significant drop in precipitation. As the planet cools, less water is evaporated from the oceans to fall back to the planet, to the surface, as precipitation. For the purpose of the study, a slightly smaller figure of 5 teragrams, 5 million tons of debris was used, rather than the upper limit of 6.6 million tons. The effect of that is to drop global temperatures about 1.3 degrees centigrade, which doesn't sound like a tremendous amount until you look at that in the context of what's happened with global warming over the last 130 years. And this slide shows all of the warming that's taken place from 1880 to the present moment, about 7/10 of a degree, shown by the blue wiggly line. The red line to the right of the slide shows the abrupt and dramatic drop in temperature, more than twice as great magnitude as the warming that's taken place, and a change that occurs over the course of days. It persists for about a decade, and then temperatures slowly come back up to their pre-war level. Global warming continues unabated. This is not a solution to the global warming problem. The change in temperature is not spread evenly over the entire surface of the planet. It is much more intense. There's much greater cooling over the internal portions of the large continents. This slide shows the change in the growing season in the first year after the war as a result of that cooling. And as you can see, the biggest changes take place in the central portions of North America and Eurasia, and the growing season declines by as much as by as much as 10 to 20 days. Very significant shortening in areas in the northern part of the United States and Canada, and in Russia and Central Asia, where the growing season is kind of marginal to begin with. As I mentioned, there's also going to be a very significant effect on precipitation, and this slide shows the change in precipitation in the summer months, June, July, and August, of the first full year after the nuclear war. And again, the areas inside the red boxes, you can see very significant declines, 40 to 50% in North India and Central Asia, up to 40% in the Eastern Mediterranean Basin, an area which is already experiencing a severe and prolonged drought, and up to 40% decline in precipitation over the Great Plains part of the United States. Similar drops here in South America. When this climate data came out in 2007, we really didn't know what this would do to agriculture. We looked at some historical experiences, events that had taken place in response to volcanic eruptions, to get some sense of what might happen. The most important of these natural cooling events took place after the Tambora volcano in Indonesia erupted in 1815. Globally, the temperature dropped about 7/10 of a degree, about half what we would see in the current scenario. The soot and debris was not pushed as high into the atmosphere by this volcano as it would be by a nuclear war. And so the effect was more transient. It lasted for just about a year, as opposed to the full decade that we would expect to see with a nuclear war. But this caused a dramatic shortening of the growing season. In North America, in Europe, significant effects. In the eastern part of the United States, there were killing frosts in June, in July, and in August. Most of the crops failed. There was widespread hunger. In Europe, in the northern part of Europe, 75% failure of the crops was experienced. And the last multi-nation famine in European history took place as a result of this. There were also famine conditions in Egypt, in South Asia, in East Asia. So that was sort of the background information that we were able to draw on. We issued a report in 2007 that suggested that a very large portion of the human race would be at risk of famine under these kinds of conditions, but we couldn't get any hard data. What's changed this year, and what was reported in our recent study, was that we were able to look over the last several months at what happens to grain production in the United States, looking at corn and at soybeans, and in China, looking at middle season rice, and to generate some hard data about the actual decline in food output that would follow a limited war in South Asia. The study that we did in the United States was based at 4 different sites in the U.S. Corn Belt, one in Iowa, one in Illinois, one in Indiana, and one in Missouri. In each of these, we saw a similar result. The probable change in crop output reflected by this series of bars gives you a nice bell-shaped curve with the most likely probability falling at a decline of about 10% at each of the sites. For soybeans, it was somewhat similar. The decline is a little bit less steep. It's about a 7% decline. Interestingly, the decline is not the same during each of the 10 years following the nuclear war. And in fact, for corn production and for soybeans, the worst impact takes place in the 5th year, when in the case of corn, production drops by more than 20%. In China, we found similar results. This slide shows the same kind of distribution curve for the likely change in rice output. And again, the most likely outcome is a decline slightly greater than corn in the U.S. of about 15%. As was the case in the United States, this is not a uniform decline over the decade. In the case of China, the most severe effects take place in the first 4 years after the nuclear war, when rice production drops an average of 21%. During the latter part of the decade, the decline is about 10%, and it averages out to about 14.5% for the decade as a whole. Interesting, well, also in China, there was a very wide geographic difference. This slide shows the percent change in rice production by province. And as you can see, provinces to the south and east, actually some of them show a slight increase in rice production average over the first 3 years. But as you move north and west, the provinces shown in different shades of sort of grayish-brown show significantly significantly decreased production. In the case of one province, Heilongjiang in particular, which is in the northeast and is home to 36 million people, in the first full year after the war, there's a complete failure of the rice crop. Production drops to 0, and it stays down in the range of 60 to 70% below normal for 5 years. This data needs to be looked at in the context of our present global situation. We are not in a good position to deal with a large decline in food production today. Right now, global grain reserves are quite low. In March of this year, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimated there was about an 80-day supply of food stored in the granaries of the world. The U.S. Department of Agriculture had a slightly more conservative figure. They said there's only about 69 days worth of food available in the granaries of the world. This is well below the historical average of 100 to 150 days over most of the last half-century, and it is a reserve which would provide very little buffer in the event of a significant drop-off in food production. In addition, we have at this moment in time a large group of people who are chronically and severely malnourished at baseline. The most recent figures on this come from the UN, again the Food and Agriculture Organization. The last time they looked at this question was in 2010, and they estimated there were 925 million people at or below the minimum daily requirement of 1,800 calories. There's some controversy in the medical literature about exactly what the level should be, but the general accepted figure is about 1,800. It's the minimum amount that you require for an average-sized adult to maintain his or her body mass and to be able to do a small amount of physical work to gather and prepare food. Among this 925 million people who are already just at this threshold level, about 5 million die each year from malnutrition, most of them children. So given this, we tried to look at what would be the effect on human beings, what would be the effect on their nutritional status if food production declined as much as is predicted by the U.S. corn and Chinese rice studies. And we worked with a group of agricultural economists who used an extremely conservative model. They assumed that the main determinant of people's food consumption would be the level of food prices. And this is in keeping with well-established observations that in famine conditions, it is not the available food that counts. It's the accessible food, the food that people can afford to buy, because the drop in available food is often magnified very significantly by severe rises in prices that simply make it impossible for poor people to buy enough food. The model, again, that this group of agricultural economists used was very conservative. It assumed that the markets would function perfectly rationally and normally in the aftermath of this war. Nonetheless, they found that the average one-year decline in food production would add an additional 40 million people to the ranks of the malnourished, that the decline in food production in the worst year, year 5, would cause 67 million people to enter the ranks of the malnourished, and the cumulative effect over the 10 years would be to cause 215 million people to be added to that group of 925 million who already suffer from chronic malnutrition. This, of course, is not the worst consequence, however. The worst consequence involves the 925 million who are malnourished to begin with. And I think the best way to look at this is just simply to look at their caloric intake today and what would happen to them if that would decrease. If you assume that it only went down by 10%, the amount that the corn goes down on average over the decade, if it only went down by 10%, these people would be losing about 175 calories a day. As you know, it's about 3,000 calories represents 1 pound of body weight if you're talking about fat. And so somebody who is losing 175 calories a day from a baseline that is just maintaining their weight is going to lose a pound every 3 weeks. To just put it very bluntly, people who are malnourished to begin with cannot afford to lose a pound every 3 weeks for a period of months, certainly not for a year, and quite definitely not for 10 years. And this has led us to say that this entire group of people would be at risk in the event that there was this kind of decline in their food consumption. In fact, the decline in food consumption would probably be much greater because market turmoil would almost certainly cause a much larger rise in food prices than would lead to a 10% decline in their food intake. We would expect panic on the markets. We would expect speculation. We would expect hoarding on a global scale. Nations that export grain would probably stop doing that and retain whatever grain they were growing to feed their own populations. And so we might see very, very large rises in food prices that would lead to much greater than 10% decline in food consumption for many of the poorest in the world. In addition to the 925 million people who are in this category, there are also 300 million people in the world today who have pretty good nutrition at the moment, but who live in countries where much of the food is imported. This is true for many of the countries in North Africa, in the Middle East, and interestingly for some of the very wealthy industrial countries of East Asia, like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, all of which import more than 50% of their grain. And so in addition to the 925 million malnourished in the world, there are 300 million people who would also be at risk in under the conditions that would follow a limited nuclear war and the resultant decline in food production that we have demonstrated. This has led us to conclude that, again, 1 billion people or more would be at risk of starvation. In addition to this, there are 2 other factors that we need to consider. One is that in the aftermath of this kind of a famine, we would expect major outbreaks of epidemic diseases. This kind of health problem has characterized every major famine that has been studied, and diseases like cholera, malaria, typhus, things which are major health problems today, would be expected to spread in epidemic fashion. And in addition, diseases like plague, which is not a very large public health threat today, could emerge again as a new and significant threat to public health. The other condition that we need to look at is the possibility for further conflict in the aftermath of this situation. given this kind of decline in food production that results in famine, there certainly would be food riots within countries, regional and ethnic tensions within countries would be exacerbated, and there's the very real possibility that there would be further conflict between states, possibly involving the further use of nuclear weapons, as countries that are desperately trying to get food for their people adopt whatever means they can to try to obtain grain to feed their starving masses. I think that these findings require a very fundamental change in our thinking about nuclear weapons. First, we have to understand that it's not only the arsenals of the U.S. and Russia that pose a global threat. Small nuclear forces like India and Pakistan threaten not only each other, but all humanity. And we need to take that into account as we look at the nuclear policies of these countries and also of the rest of the world towards these countries. But the even more important lesson is that we need to look at the much larger arsenals of the other nuclear powers, particularly the U.S. and Russia, in a totally different way. One U.S. Trident submarine is usually equipped with 24 missiles, each of which carries 4 warheads. Each of these warheads is 10 to 30 times larger than the Hiroshima-sized bombs used in the South Asia scenario. That means that each Trident submarine in the U.S. arsenal is capable of creating the nuclear famine scenario that I've described to you and putting more than 1 billion people at risk many times over. We have 14 of these submarines, and they are only a part of our arsenal. We also have a fleet of land-based missiles, and we have a fleet of long-range bombers that are equipped and designed to carry nuclear bombs and nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. There is the same extraordinary redundancy, the extraordinary overkill in the Russian arsenal. And I think that the finding that a single submarine in our arsenal is capable of causing a global disaster really mandates a totally different look at our nuclear forces. The nuclear famine study flowed from climate studies that were twofold. They looked both at a limited war in South Asia, but also at what would happen if there were a large-scale war between the U.S. and Russia. And I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about this dimension as well. We tend to act as though nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia isn't going to happen. It's off the table. We don't need to think about it. As we all know, even though the United States and Russia do not consider themselves enemies anymore, they continue to point thousands of warheads at each other. And there's something very odd about this situation that suggests that the reported friendship between these two countries is not as reliable as we would like to think. If it were, there'd be no reason to have these arsenals pointing at each other and maintain what the New York Times is now calling air trigger alert. There is always the possibility that the situation between the U.S. and Russia will deteriorate and that these arsenals will be used. More likely, these arsenals might find themselves being used by accident. As we know, since 1979, there have been at least 5 occasions when either the United States or Russia prepared to launch a nuclear war in the mistaken belief that it was under attack by the other side. The most recent of these took place in January of 1995, a full 5 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the conditions which existed at that time, which almost allowed a nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia, have not changed fundamentally. The same kind of accident could occur today, and we could, again, as on those previous 5 occasions, find ourselves with one or the other side believing it's under attack, and perhaps this time actually launching a nuclear war. Kuhn and Roebuck looked at this question as well, and what they found is that if all of the weapons that will be allowed to the United States and Russia, the strategic weapons, under the New START Treaty when it's fully implemented, if all of those weapons were used in a nuclear conflict, they would put not 5 teragrams of debris into the troposphere, but 150 teragrams of debris. And that would drop global temperatures not 1.3 degrees centigrade, but 8 degrees centigrade on average. Again, as was the case with the small war in South Asia, the temperature drops are much more severe in the internal regions of North America and Eurasia. This slide shows the temperatures in the summer months, June, July, and August of the second year after a large-scale war between the United States and Russia. And as you can see, in the interior regions of North America, the temperatures are down by up to 25 degrees centigrade. In the interior regions of Eurasia, temperatures are down by up to 30 degrees centigrade. There have not been temperatures that cold on this planet for 18,000 years, since the coldest point of the last ice age. For 3 years following a war of this magnitude, there would not be a single day in the northern hemisphere free of frost. That means there would be no agriculture, no food production at all. Ecosystems across the planet would collapse. Many, many species would become extinct. It is probable that the vast majority of the human race would starve to death, and it is possible that Homo sapiens would become extinct. This finding is also something which I think we have a responsibility to bring to public attention. And again, this material is making its way somewhat into the public consciousness over the last couple of months. Actually, even before we released the report, we had been discussing this with many of our partners in the peace community and with many friendly governments. One of the things that was most encouraging to me we had a meeting this past week where I did a presentation at the invitation of the Swiss and Norwegian foreign ministries, was that even before our session, discussion of nuclear winter and global famine played a prominent role in the conference. And I think we have a real opportunity at this point and a real responsibility to take advantage of that opportunity to get out the word. It's always been PSR's central role to educate the public about the medical consequences of nuclear war. We often find that a difficult job. It's not pleasant stuff to talk about or think about. We've been doing it for a long time, and sometimes it feels like we're beating our heads up against the wall. Sometimes it's kind of hard to get an audience to listen to us, and to gather an audience for us to talk to. But something does seem to be changing at the present moment, and I think we have probably the best chance to get out this information that we've had in the last 20 years. And there's a real responsibility that comes with that opportunity for us to seize the moment and really move forward and get word out. So let me stop here.